There exists a transformation that psychology rarely discusses, but that countless people experience: the shift from empathic, open, emotionally generous person to someone who exhibits avoidant patterns, emotional withdrawal, and defensive distance. This transformation is not about fundamental personality change or about discovering that you were always secretly avoidant underneath your empathic presentation. It's about protective adaptation that occurs when someone whose natural inclination is toward connection, vulnerability, and emotional openness experiences repeated betrayal, disappointment, and hurt that their openness invited. The empath who becomes avoidant is not abandoning their true nature. They're protecting it, building walls around the very sensitivity and emotional generosity that made them vulnerable to being hurt in the first place. This protective transformation happens gradually through accumulation of experiences where being open led to pain, where trusting led to betrayal, where giving freely led to being taken advantage of, where loving deeply led to being abandoned or mistreated. After enough repetitions of this pattern, after enough people proved unworthy of the trust and vulnerability offered to them, the empathic person begins to change their approach. They become guarded where they were once open. They withhold where they once gave freely. They maintain distance where they once pursued closeness. They protect their heart where they once offered it readily. From the outside, this transformed person might appear to be avoidant, displaying many of the same behaviors and patterns that characterize avoidant attachment. But the mechanism underneath is different. The natural avoidant learned in childhood that closeness is dangerous and organized their entire personality around preventing vulnerability. The transformed empath learned through adult experiences that their openness and generosity were being exploited, and they made conscious or semi-conscious decision to protect themselves differently. Understanding this transformation is crucial because the path back to openness for the transformed empath is different from the healing work required for someone with deeply rooted avoidant attachment. The transformed empath hasn't lost their capacity for connection. They've buried it under protective layers that served a purpose, but that might now be preventing them from experiencing the genuine, reciprocal love they still long for underneath the defenses. The transformation no one talks about, from open heart to closed doors. The journey from empathic openness to avoidant closure is not sudden dramatic shift, but rather gradual transformation that happens through accumulation of experiences that teach the empathic person that their natural way of relating is dangerous and leads to harm. Understanding this progression illuminates both how the transformation occurs and why it represents logical, protective response to patterns of being hurt rather than fundamental change in who the person is at their core. The empathic person begins their adult relational life with natural inclination toward emotional openness, generosity, and trust. They believe in the goodness of people. They approach relationships with optimism and willingness to be vulnerable. They give people the benefit of the doubt. They express their feelings freely. They invest deeply and quickly when they feel connection. They make themselves available emotionally and practically to people they care about. They forgive easily and give multiple chances. All of these tendencies come from place of emotional health and capacity for intimacy, from secure or anxious attachment that, while sometimes creating challenges, fundamentally values and pursues connection. The first betrayals or disappointments are typically absorbed without changing the empathic person's fundamental approach. They might be hurt by a partner who takes advantage of their generosity, who exploits their forgiveness, who betrays their trust, or who abandons them despite their deep investment. But the empathic person processes this hurt as being about that specific person rather than as being about their approach to relationships. They tell themselves they chose poorly, that this particular person wasn't worthy of what they offered, that the next person will be different. They maintain their openness, their willingness to trust, their generous approach to loving. This resilience and optimism is beautiful, but also makes them vulnerable to repeating similar patterns. The transformation begins when the pattern repeats multiple times with different people. The empath finds themselves in relationship with avoidant person who withdraws from their love. Then they encounter narcissist who exploits their empathy. Then they meet someone who uses their emotional availability without reciprocating. Then they experience someone who takes their generosity for granted while giving nothing in return. Each of these experiences, individually, might be survivable without fundamental change, but the accumulation creates dawning recognition that something about their approach is consistently leading to hurt, that their openness is being exploited rather than honored, that their way of loving is attracting people who cannot or will not reciprocate appropriately. This recognition creates first shift in the empathic person's approach. They begin to question their own patterns and instincts. They wonder if they're too trusting, too open, too giving, too forgiving, too available. They start to see their empathic qualities, which they once viewed as strengths, as potential vulnerabilities or flaws. They notice that the very qualities that make them good partners, good friends, good people, are the qualities that seem to attract those who would exploit or betray them. This awareness is painful because it suggests that being authentically themselves, operating according to their natural emotional generosity, leads to being hurt. The empathic person then begins to modify their behavior in protective ways. They might start withholding their feelings rather than expressing them freely, testing whether others will pursue or whether emotional availability has to always come from them. They might pull back from giving so generously, waiting to see if others will give first or will notice the change. They might become more guarded about their vulnerabilities, sharing less quickly or deeply than they naturally would. They might create more distance in relationships, maintaining more independence and separation than feels natural to them, but that seems safer than the merger and closeness that led to hurt before. These initial modifications are conscious protective strategies rather than fundamental personality changes. The empathic person is still empathic underneath, still values connection, still wants intimacy, but they're trying to protect themselves while still remaining open to relationship. This middle stage is often characterized by internal conflict. Part of them wants to love freely and openly, as they always have. Another part warns them that this openness led to pain and that they need to be more careful, more guarded, more protected. This conflict creates inconsistency in their behavior, where they might be very open one moment and then suddenly withdrawn the next, as different parts of themselves assert dominance. The full transformation to avoidant presenting behavior occurs when the protective strategies become habitual and automatic, rather than conscious and deliberate. After enough time operating with guards up, after enough reinforcement of the idea that protection is necessary, after enough experiences that seem to confirm that being open leads to pain, the defensive behaviors become the default. The empathic person no longer consciously decides to withhold or create distance. They simply do it automatically, without thinking, as first response rather than as protective measure they're deliberately choosing. At this stage, the transformed empath displays many of the same behaviors as someone with lifelong avoidant attachment. They struggle to be vulnerable. They create distance when relationships become too close. They prioritize independence and self-sufficiency. They're guarded about their feelings. They might even pursue unavailable people while keeping available people at arm's length. They withhold emotionally. They struggle with commitment. They maintain escape routes. All of these behaviors mirror avoidant attachment so closely that others, and sometimes the transformed empath themselves, might believe they've always been avoidant or that they've discovered their true avoidant nature. But the mechanism underneath is different. The natural avoidant developed these patterns in childhood as response to caregivers who didn't meet their needs or who punished vulnerability. These patterns are deeply embedded in their nervous system and their core beliefs about relationships and self. The transformed empath developed these patterns as adult in response to repeated experiences where their natural openness was exploited. Their patterns are protective adaptations that sit on top of their core nature rather than being expressions of that nature. This distinction matters enormously for understanding what healing and change require. The transformation is also reinforced by the empathic person's interpretation of their experiences. They might conclude that their past hurts happened because they were too naive, too trusting, too emotional, too giving. They decide they need to be more like the people who hurt them, more guarded and self-protective, less vulnerable and open. They might even admire the avoidant or narcissistic people they encountered for their apparent imperviousness to hurt, for their ability to maintain distance and control. This admiration and the decision to emulate these qualities represents fundamental misunderstanding of what creates safety and fulfillment, but its understandable response to pain. The protective walls built from repeated wounds, the specific defensive walls that the transformed empath constructs are both similar to and different from the defenses that natural avoidants employ. Understanding these walls, how they function, and what purpose they serve illuminates both the pain that created them and the specific challenges involved in eventually dismantling them when they've outlived their protective purpose. The first wall the transformed empath builds is emotional withholding, the decision to stop freely expressing feelings, needs, and desires that made them vulnerable to disappointment and exploitation. The empath learned that expressing love openly led to that love being taken for granted or used against them. Expressing needs led to those needs being dismissed or being labeled as too much. Expressing desires led to disappointment when those desires weren't met or were ignored. So they stop expressing. They keep their feelings to themselves. They minimize their needs or try to meet them independently. They abandon their desires or convince themselves they don't want much anyway. This withholding protects them from the specific pain of having their expressions dismissed, rejected, or exploited, but it also prevents the genuine intimacy that requires mutual vulnerability and expression. The second wall is the testing and waiting strategy, where the transformed empath stops initiating connection, stops pursuing, stops being the one who always reaches out or makes effort, instead waiting to see if others will pursue them or demonstrate care without the empath having to ask for it. This strategy develops from repeated experiences of being the only one putting in effort, of relationships being entirely dependent on the empath's energy and initiative, of discovering that when they stop pursuing, others don't pursue them back. The transformed empath decides to protect themselves by making others prove their interest and investment before the empath invests their own emotional energy. This protection makes logical sense, but often backfires because truly secure, reciprocal people don't play games or respond well to tests, while the avoidant or narcissistic people who hurt the empath before are often stimulated by the chase that this testing creates. The third wall is skepticism and suspicion, where the transformed empath no longer takes people at their word, but instead watches behavior carefully for signs of the manipulation, exploitation, or abandonment they've experienced before. They become hypervigilant to red flags. They interpret ambiguous behaviors in negative ways. They expect betrayal or disappointment as likely outcomes. They maintain protective distance emotionally, even when physically present. This skepticism protects them from being blindsided or from trusting too quickly those who don't deserve trust. but it also prevents them from seeing and appreciating genuine good faith and trustworthiness when it appears. Everyone becomes suspect until proven otherwise, and the standards for proof might be so high that no one can meet them. The fourth wall is independence as armor, the decision to become so self-sufficient and independent that they don't need anyone for anything, that they can provide everything for themselves emotionally and practically. The transformed empath learned that depending on others led to disappointment when those others didn't come through, or when they used the empath's dependence as leverage. So the empath eliminates dependence entirely, meeting all their own needs, solving all their own problems, being complete unto themselves. This independence protects them from disappointment and from giving others power over their well-being, but it also prevents the healthy interdependence that genuine partnership requires and that creates security and depth in relationships. The fifth wall is the emotional shutdown, or numbing, where the transformed empath learns to disconnect from their feelings rather than feeling them fully. They recognize that their deep feeling capacity, their ability to love intensely and care profoundly, is what made betrayal so painful. So they consciously or unconsciously turn down the volume on their emotional life. They don't allow themselves to feel as deeply. They maintain emotional distance from their own experience. They intellectualize rather than feel. They stay busy to avoid sitting with emotions. This numbing protects them from the intensity of pain they experienced when they cared deeply about people who hurt them, but it also removes their access to joy, connection, and the positive, intense emotions that made life rich and meaningful. The sixth wall is selective availability, where the transformed empath chooses relationships with people who are clearly unavailable, unsuitable, or incapable of genuine intimacy, protecting themselves from the vulnerability that comes with genuinely available partnership. They might pursue people who are geographically distant, already in relationships, emotionally unavailable due to their own attachment wounds, or otherwise unable to provide real relationship. This pattern protects the empath from having to be vulnerable with someone who could actually know them and potentially hurt them, but it also ensures they never experience the genuine partnership they claim to want. The seventh wall is the exit strategy maintenance, where the transformed empath always keeps one foot out the door, maintains escape routes, refuses to fully commit, and stays ready to leave at first sign of potential hurt. They might refuse to make plans too far in advance, might maintain separate living situations when cohabitation would make sense, might keep their finances completely separate, might maintain active dating profiles even in committed relationships. These exit strategies protect them from being trapped in situations where they're being hurt and from the vulnerability of being fully invested in something they could lose. But they also prevent the full commitment and investment that allows relationships to deepen and become truly secure. These walls, built piece by piece through experiences of being hurt while open and vulnerable, create fortress around the transformed empath's heart. The fortress is effective at preventing certain types of harm, particularly the harm that comes from trusting too quickly or giving too freely to those who don't deserve it or can't reciprocate. But the fortress also keeps out genuine connection, reciprocal love, and the very intimacy that the empath's core nature still longs for. The walls don't distinguish between people who would hurt them and people who wouldn't. They keep everyone at the same distance, preventing both exploitation and genuine love. How former empaths display avoidance differently than natural avoidance. While the transformed empath may display behaviors that closely resemble avoidant attachment, there are subtle but important differences in how former empaths manifest avoidance compared to people with lifelong avoidant patterns. These differences reflect the distinct origins of their defensive strategies and create distinct implications for what healing and change require. Understanding these differences helps both the transformed empath and those who care about them to recognize what's actually happening underneath the avoidant presentation. The first key difference is that the transformed empath's avoidance is more situation dependent and inconsistent than the natural avoidance patterns. Natural avoidants display their patterns relatively consistently across situations and relationships, withdrawing from intimacy in predictable ways, regardless of who the partner is or what the circumstances are. But the transformed empath might display avoidance in some contexts, while remaining quite open in others. They might be very guarded in romantic relationships where they've been hurt most, but remain emotionally generous with friends or family. They might be avoidant with certain types of people who remind them of past hurts, but surprisingly open with people who feel safer. This inconsistency reveals that the avoidance is protective response to perceived threat rather than deeply embedded personality organization. The second difference is that the transformed empath experiences internal conflict about their avoidant behaviors in ways that natural avoidants typically don't. The natural avoidance patterns feel ego-syntonic, meaning they align with their sense of self and their values. They believe independence is good, that their need for space is legitimate, that their discomfort with vulnerability is justified. But the transformed empath often experiences their avoidant behaviors as ego-dystonic, meaning the behaviors conflict with their core sense of self and values. They don't like that they're being guarded or distant. They feel conflict between their protective impulses and their deeper desire for connection. They recognize that their defensive strategies are preventing something they actually want, creating internal tension that natural avoidants don't experience to the same degree. The third difference lies in the capacity for empathy and emotional attunement that the transformed empath retains even while displaying avoidant behaviors. Natural avoidants often struggle with empathy and with recognizing or responding to others' emotional needs. They're not particularly attuned to how their withdrawal affects their partners. They don't easily understand others' perspectives or feelings. But the transformed empath, despite their defensive walls, retains their fundamental empathic capacity. They can still read others' emotions accurately. They still understand how their behavior affects others. They feel guilty about the hurt their withdrawal causes in ways that natural avoidants typically don't. This retained empathy creates additional internal conflict and can be pathway back to openness if they learn to trust again. The fourth difference is the speed of attachment and intensity of early connection. Natural avoidants tend to remain somewhat distant and guarded even in the early stages of relationships, maintaining their defenses from the beginning. But transformed empaths often display their old empathic patterns early in relationships before their defenses are fully activated, creating intense early connections that then shift dramatically once the empath's protective patterns are triggered. They might be very open and vulnerable initially, only to pull back sharply when the relationship reaches depth that activates their fears of being hurt again. This shift can be confusing to partners who experience the empath's genuine openness early on and then encounter the defensive withdrawal later. The fifth difference is in the motivation for maintaining distance. Natural avoidants maintain distance because closeness feels inherently uncomfortable and threatening due to their childhood experiences and nervous system responses. They're managing their own discomfort with intimacy. Transformed empaths maintain distance, primarily to protect themselves from the specific harm they've experienced, from being exploited or betrayed or abandoned. They're managing fear of repetition of past patterns, rather than managing inherent discomfort with closeness itself. This distinction means that transformed empaths might be willing to risk closeness if they believe they've found someone who won't repeat the patterns that hurt them, whereas natural avoidants will struggle with closeness regardless of how trustworthy the partner is. The sixth difference appears in how they respond to their partner's needs and vulnerabilities. Natural avoidants often become uncomfortable or dismissive when partners express needs or show vulnerability, experiencing these expressions as pressure or burden. But transformed empaths, even while maintaining their own guards, often respond quite well to others' vulnerability. They can provide empathy, support, and care when others need it, even while protecting themselves from being vulnerable in return. This capacity to meet others' needs while struggling to express their own reveals that their core empathic nature remains active even underneath defensive presentation. The seventh difference is evident in their relationship history and how they speak about it. Natural avoidants often have consistent pattern of relatively shallow relationships, serial dating without deep connection, or long periods of being single. They might describe past partners as having been too needy or too demanding, framing their exits as necessary for their freedom. Transformed empaths typically have history that includes at least some deep, meaningful relationships where they were quite invested and vulnerable, followed by a pattern of hurt that led to their current guardedness. They describe their past relationships with pain and sometimes regret, recognizing they were hurt rather than framing themselves as having escaped excessive demands. The eighth difference lies in their response to genuine reciprocity and safety. Natural avoidance will often withdraw even from partners who are healthy, secure, and reciprocal because the closeness itself triggers their defenses regardless of the partner's qualities. But transformed empaths can respond quite well to genuinely safe, reciprocal partnership if they learn to recognize it and trust it. When they encounter someone who demonstrates consistent care without exploitation, who respects boundaries without taking advantage, who values their empathic nature without exploiting it, the transformed empath's defenses may gradually lower in ways that natural avoidance defenses typically don't. This responsiveness to genuine safety is evidence that the avoidance is protective rather than fundamental. These differences matter enormously for the transformed empath's path forward. Understanding that their avoidant presentation is protective adaptation rather than core personality allows them to envision change and healing in ways that feel possible. They haven't become fundamentally different people. They've protected their core nature under layers of defense that served important purpose, but that might now be preventing them from experiencing the love and connection they still fundamentally desire. The path back to trusting without losing. The lessons learned. The question facing the transformed empath is not whether to simply return to their old pattern of open, unguarded vulnerability that led to repeated hurt, but rather how to find a middle path that honors both their core empathic nature and the legitimate lessons learned through painful experiences. This path back to openness without naive vulnerability is challenging because it requires integrating seemingly contradictory truths, that connection and love are worth pursuing, and that protection and discernment are necessary, that vulnerability is strength, and that boundaries are essential, that trust is possible, and that caution is warranted. Creating this integration is the healing work required for transformed empaths. The first step is recognizing and acknowledging what happened, understanding that the shift from empathic openness to avoidant guardedness was protective response to genuine harm rather than evidence of fundamental flaw in who they were before. The transformed empath needs to validate their own experience, to acknowledge that the betrayals and disappointments they experienced were real and significant, and to recognize that their defensive response was logical attempt at self-protection rather than sign of weakness or brokenness. This validation is crucial because many transformed empaths blame themselves for their past hurts, believing they were too naive, too stupid, too weak. This self-blame prevents healing because it suggests the problem was fundamental flaw in them rather than problematic choice of partners or lack of boundaries that can be learned. The second step involves grief work, allowing themselves to feel and process the pain of the betrayals that led to their defensive transformation. Many transformed empaths never fully grieved their losses because they moved directly into protective shutdown or into the next relationship where they tried to prove they wouldn't be hurt again. But unprocessed grief creates ongoing pain that fuels defensive behaviors. The empath needs to sit with the sadness of having trusted people who proved untrustworthy, of having loved people who couldn't reciprocate, of having given generously to people who exploited, rather than honoring that generosity. This grief work allows them to close those chapters genuinely, rather than keeping them alive through defensive patterns designed to prevent similar hurt. The third step is learning discernment, developing ability to assess people's character and capacity before investing deeply, rather than either giving everyone the benefit of the doubt immediately or trusting no one at all. Discernment is different from the hypervigilant suspicion many transformed empaths develop. Discernment involves observing people's behavior over time, noting whether actions align with words, assessing whether they demonstrate reciprocity and respect for boundaries, evaluating whether they're capable of the kind of relationship the empath needs. This observational period doesn't involve testing or game playing. It involves simply paying attention to who people show themselves to be before deciding they've earned the empath's vulnerability and trust. The fourth step is developing healthy boundaries that protect without closing off entirely. The transformed empath swung from insufficient boundaries to walls that keep everyone out. The healing work involves finding the balance where boundaries protect their needs and values, while allowing genuine connection with people who prove trustworthy. These boundaries might include being clear about needs and expectations from the beginning, communicating directly when those needs aren't being met, maintaining separate self and interests even within relationship, and being willing to end relationships that aren't reciprocal or healthy, rather than enduring out of hope or history. The fifth step involves practicing selective vulnerability, learning to share and open up incrementally based on evidence of the other person's trustworthiness, rather than either sharing everything immediately or sharing nothing at all. This graduated approach allows the empath to test the waters, to see how people handle small vulnerabilities before offering larger ones, to build trust based on demonstrated safe handling of what's been shared. If someone responds well to small vulnerability, earning the empath's trust through their response, deeper vulnerability can follow. If someone responds poorly, the empath can protect themselves without having overinvested. The sixth step is self-compassion work, learning to be kind to themselves both about the past hurts and about the defensive patterns they developed. Many transformed empaths judge themselves harshly for having been hurt or for having become guarded and closed. But both the initial openness and the subsequent protection make sense given their circumstances and history. They need compassion for the part of them that trusted and was hurt, and compassion for the part of them that built walls to prevent further hurt. This self-compassion creates internal safety that makes it easier to gradually lower external defenses. The seventh step involves deliberately practicing small acts of openness and trust, consciously choosing moments to be vulnerable or generous, even while the protective instinct urges guardedness. These practices don't mean returning to unprotected openness with everyone. They mean selectively, deliberately choosing to risk vulnerability with specific people in specific contexts, building evidence that not everyone will hurt them, that some people can be trusted, that their empathic nature can be honored rather than exploited. Each positive experience of managed vulnerability helps recalibrate the nervous system's assessment of what's safe. The eighth step is accepting that some risk is inherent in love and connection, that there's no way to protect themselves completely from potential hurt without also preventing genuine intimacy. The transformed empath must consciously choose to value connection enough to accept some level of vulnerability and risk. This doesn't mean ignoring red flags or trusting people who haven't earned it. It means recognizing that even with careful discernment and healthy boundaries, loving someone means they could hurt you, and choosing to take that risk with people who demonstrate through consistent behavior that they're worthy of it. The path back also involves distinguishing between the people and situations that warrant guarded protection versus those that warrant gradual opening. Not everyone deserves the transformed empath's vulnerability and trust, but some people do. The work is learning to tell the difference, to recognize genuine reciprocity and safety when it appears, to not punish safe people for what unsafe people did. This discrimination allows the empath to maintain protection where it's needed while being open where it's safe. Crucially, the path back doesn't mean forgetting the lessons learned or becoming naive again. The transformed empath doesn't need to unlearn their hard-won wisdom about red flags, about the importance of reciprocity, about the necessity of boundaries. They need to integrate that wisdom with their core empathic nature, creating more mature, boundaried version of openness rather than returning to the unprotected vulnerability that led to harm. This integration creates what's sometimes called earned secure attachment, where someone who was hurt learns to trust again while maintaining healthy self-protection, combining the best of their empathic nature with wisdom and boundaries they've learned. The transformed empath can heal. The walls can come down gradually with safe people. The capacity for love and connection that was buried under protection is still there, waiting to be accessed again when conditions are safe enough. But this healing is process, not event, requiring patience, self-compassion, and willingness to risk small vulnerabilities before larger ones, to trust incrementally rather than all at once, and to honor both their need for connection and their need for protection as they find their way back to authentic relating that doesn't sacrifice their well-being for the sake of love.